Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our story. The following day, Mark found himself standing in front of the grand gates of Eleanor's estate, his heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and disbelief. The mansion loomed before him, its towering columns and pristine stone facade exuding wealth and power. Mark felt like an intruder in a world that was not his own. He had grown up in a small town, his family struggling to make ends meet after his father's sudden passing. Now, here he was, about to marry a woman he barely knew for the promise of financial security. It was hard to believe that such a drastic change was happening in his life. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, the sound of his shoes echoing on the long driveway. As Mark reached the front door, it swung open before he had a chance to knock. Eleanor stood there, her presence as commanding as ever. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her silver hair perfectly styled. She looked every bit the powerful businesswoman he had imagined, and yet there was something about her that made Mark feel small in comparison. "Come in, Mr. Davis," she said, her voice cool but welcoming. "I trust you've had no trouble finding your way?" Mark nodded, though his nerves were evident. "It's hard to miss," he muttered, glancing around at the sprawling estate. Eleanor smiled faintly and motioned for him to enter. "Follow me," she said, leading him inside. The interior of the mansion was just as grand as the outside: marble floors, high ceilings, and art adorning every wall. Mark couldn't help but feel out of place as he walked through the luxurious hallways. He had never seen anything like this before, and it made him feel like a boy playing dress-up in a world that wasn't his. "Please, have a seat," Eleanor said as she gestured to a plush armchair in the sitting room. Mark sat down, feeling the weight of the situation settle in his chest. Eleanor took a seat across from him, her posture poised and confident. "I'm glad you could make it today," she said, her eyes locking with his. "I know this is a big step, but I'm confident that it's the right one for both of us. You'll find that I'm a woman of my word." Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. He had spent the entire night thinking about the arrangement, wondering if he was making a huge mistake or if this was his only chance to secure his future. But now that he was here, sitting across from Eleanor in her luxurious home, the decision felt even more surreal. "I'm still processing everything," he admitted, his voice low. "This all feels like it's happening too fast. I mean, we barely know each other. Are you sure this is what you want?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. "I've made my decision. I don't need love, Mark. What I need is someone I can trust, someone who won't care about my wealth but will stand by me when it matters most." She paused for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Mark didn't know what to say. He had never been in a situation like this before, being offered something so life-changing for something so simple, yet so complex, as a marriage contract. "I'm not asking for your heart, Mark," Eleanor continued, her voice softer now. "I'm asking for your loyalty and your partnership. We both stand to gain from this arrangement. I know it sounds cold, but it's a business decision. And I promise you, once this contract is signed, everything you've been struggling with will be behind you. You'll never have to worry about money again." Mark looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He had never been so conflicted in his life. Part of him wanted to reject the offer, to walk away and find another way to fix his problems. But another part of him knew that, without Eleanor's help, he might never get out of the hole he was in. This could be his chance to secure a future for himself and his family. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor smiled again, her eyes gleaming with something that Mark couldn't quite read. "Next, we sign the contract. And then, we begin our new lives together. You'll be the man of this house, and I'll be your partner in everything. We'll work together, live together, and build a future that neither of us could have achieved on our own." Mark's heart raced again, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from a strange sense of possibility. This could be the fresh start he had been waiting for. But as the weight of the decision settled in, Mark knew that his life would never be the same again. "All right," he said quietly, nodding slowly. "Let's do it." Eleanor's smile deepened, her eyes never leaving his as she reached for the papers on the table. "Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis," she said, as she slid the contract in front of him. Mark's fingers trembled as he picked up the pen. This was a moment that would change everything. He took a deep breath, signed his name, and sealed his fate. As he put the pen down, he realized that he wasn't just signing a contract. He was stepping into a new world, one that promised both opportunity and uncertainty, and he couldn't help but wonder what would come next. It had been a week since Mark signed the contract, and he was still adjusting to his new life. Eleanor had kept her word. She had arranged for him to move into one of the guest suites in the mansion, and the staff treated him with a level of respect that felt strange, almost foreign. The mansion, with its marble floors and sprawling gardens, was a far cry from the cramped apartment he had shared with his mother. Everything about this new world was overwhelming, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease in her surroundings. She was always poised, always in control, never showing the slightest sign of uncertainty. But behind her perfect exterior, Mark sensed a deep loneliness, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Their interactions were strictly professional, no surprises there. Eleanor had made it clear from the start that their relationship would be based on mutual benefit, not affection. They shared meals, attended events together, and exchanged pleasantries, but there was never anything beyond that. Mark found himself constantly watching her, trying to understand the woman who had offered him so much without asking for anything in return. Her cold, businesslike demeanor remained intact, but Mark couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her story. One afternoon, Mark sat in his office, going over some of the financial documents Eleanor had given him. His mind kept wandering back to their conversation from the other night, the one where Eleanor had shared a glimpse of her true self. She had mentioned that she didn't need love, but it was hard for Mark to believe that. He had seen the way she looked at him sometimes, as if searching for something in his eyes, and he couldn't help but wonder if she was starting to regret her decision. That evening, they attended a charity gala high-profile event that Eleanor had insisted they go to together. As they arrived at the venue, the flashing cameras and well-dressed guests made Mark feel like a fish out of water. He had never been to such a glamorous event before, and it was clear that all eyes were on Eleanor, the woman everyone admired and respected. She moved through the crowd with ease, her every step measured and confident, while Mark followed behind her like a shadow. "Mr. Davis, I trust you'll enjoy the evening," Eleanor said, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "Remember, we're here to represent the company, not to socialize." Mark nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in his stomach. He had no idea how to navigate an event like this, let alone try to fit in with people who had spent their lives in this world of wealth and power. But Eleanor didn't seem to notice his discomfort. She was already deep in conversation with several high-ranking individuals, her smile perfect and her posture flawless. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself standing alone in a corner of the ballroom, watching Eleanor from a distance. She was engaged in a lively discussion with a group of business magnates, and Mark couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy. She was so confident, so at ease in this world. But as he watched her interact with others, he began to notice something that struck him. Despite her success and charm, there was a sadness in her eyes, something he had never seen before, but something that felt all too familiar. He couldn't help himself. He moved closer to her, unable to shake the urge to speak to her, to understand her better. "You're doing well," Mark said quietly, standing by her side. Eleanor looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "Thank you," she replied, her voice smooth but distant. "But I don't need your approval, Mark." Mark looked at her, surprised by her coldness. "I didn't mean it like that," he said quickly. "I just meant I've been watching you. You seem at ease with all of this." Eleanor's expression softened for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're new to all of this, Mark. You'll get used to it," she said, her voice back to its usual businesslike tone. Mark wanted to ask more, to delve deeper into what she was really feeling, but he held back. Instead, he forced a smile and nodded, accepting that this was the extent of their connection for now. He had made his decision, and now he had to live with it. The night ended with more pleasantries and small talk, and as they left the gala, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something Eleanor had yet to reveal. As he climbed into the car beside her, he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. She was staring out the window, lost in thought, her face illuminated by the city lights. For the first time, Mark saw the vulnerability beneath her icy exterior, and he realized that, just like him, she too was struggling with something deeper than what met the eye. As the car drove through the streets, Mark sat in silence, wondering if he would ever truly understand Eleanor, or if, perhaps, she was a mystery he was never meant to solve. The next few days passed in a blur of business meetings, charity events, and social gatherings. Mark had settled into his new routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. He had moved into Eleanor's world, but it felt more like an act than a life. The mansion was magnificent, but it was also cold and impersonal. The staff were respectful, yet distant, and there was always an underlying sense of formality that Mark couldn't quite get used to. He still had moments where he questioned his decision. Was this really the life he wanted? Was the financial security worth the cost of his own happiness? Eleanor had kept her distance, maintaining the professional boundaries they had established on day one. There were no romantic gestures, no sweet words, just business, always business. But there were moments, fleeting as they were, when Mark saw something else in Eleanor, something more human. A crack in her carefully constructed exterior. It happened during one of their late-night dinners. She had been unusually quiet, staring at her glass of wine as if lost in thought. Mark had never seen her like this before. "Is everything all right?" he asked, unable to ignore the change in her demeanor. Eleanor looked up, her expression guarded. For a moment, Mark thought she would brush him off, like she always did. But this time, she sighed softly. "I'm fine," she said, her voice soft but tired. "It's just sometimes, I wonder if I made the right choice." Mark felt a pang of curiosity. "What do you mean?" She paused, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her glass. "I've spent my whole life building this empire," she said, her voice quiet, almost melancholic. "But sometimes, I wonder if it's all worth it. I've surrounded myself with people who admire my success, but I've never had someone who truly cares about me. Someone who doesn't see me as a business deal." Mark's heart softened. He had always seen Eleanor as this untouchable, powerful woman, someone who had everything under control. But now, he saw the cracks, the loneliness she tried so hard to hide. For a moment, he could relate. He had always believed that financial security and success would solve all his problems, but now he knew that wasn't true. Eleanor's words resonated with him more than he expected. "You don't need to do this alone," Mark said quietly, not sure where the words were coming from. "You're not just a business deal to me, Eleanor. You're more than that." She looked at him then, her gaze piercing. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Mark could see the walls around her begin to crumble. But just as quickly, she looked away, composing herself. "Thank you, Mark," she said, her voice back to its usual coolness. "But we both know why we're here. This is about business, not feelings." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't expect anything more from her, but the brief connection they shared left him with a strange feeling, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. As the days went by, Mark began to see more of Eleanor's vulnerability, hidden behind her confident facade. She was always the picture of control in public, but in private, there were moments when the weight of her responsibilities seemed to crush her. He watched her more closely now, noticing the subtle signs, the way she sighed when she thought no one was looking, the tiredness that lingered in her eyes after a long day of meetings. But despite everything, Eleanor remained as distant as ever. She kept their relationship strictly professional, maintaining the boundaries she had set from the beginning. Mark respected that, but he couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her, if the woman he was married to for business reasons was capable of more than just keeping up appearances. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, going over the latest financial reports, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Eleanor. Meet me in the library in 30 minutes. I need to discuss something important. Mark felt a flicker of unease. What could she want now? He quickly stood up, smoothing his jacket as he made his way to the library. When he arrived, Eleanor was standing by the window, her back to him, staring out at the garden. You wanted to see me? Mark asked, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression serious. I've been thinking, she began, her tone colder than usual. About our arrangement. I want to make sure we're both on the same page moving forward. This isn't just about the business anymore. We need to set clear boundaries. I don't want any confusion. Mark felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. What do you mean? Eleanor's gaze softened slightly. I'm just saying, we need to remember why we're doing this. There can't be any personal involvement. I can't allow myself to get distracted. You understand, right? Mark nodded slowly, a bitter taste in his mouth. It was the same as before, cold, professional, no room for anything else. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder if Eleanor was hiding something more, something she wasn't willing to admit to herself. As he left the library, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to change between them, whether Eleanor wanted to acknowledge it or not. The days that followed the conversation in the library felt heavier than ever. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in a world that wasn't his own. Despite the lavish lifestyle and the promise of financial security, there was something missing. The emotional connection he had hoped for with Eleanor was absent, and every time he tried to bridge the gap, he was met with a cold wall of professionalism. Eleanor had made it clear this arrangement was not about feelings. But something inside Mark refused to let go. He had come to admire her, not just for her success but for the vulnerability he glimpsed in her eyes on rare occasions. Yet, every time he tried to get closer, Eleanor pulled back. She remained a woman of business, always calculated, always in control. Her facade never wavered. And though Mark respected the boundaries she set, a part of him couldn't help but feel that, beneath it all, she was just as lost as he was. One evening, Mark stood at the balcony of the mansion, staring out at the sprawling estate. The city lights twinkled in the distance, but they felt so far away, as if a lifetime separated him from everything he used to know. He thought about the first time he met Eleanor, how detached she had seemed, yet there was something about her that had drawn him in. Her strength, her confidence, her control over everything. He had thought he could never belong in her world. But now, he realized, that wasn't the only thing keeping him at a distance. His thoughts were interrupted when Eleanor stepped outside onto the balcony, her heels clicking against the marble floor. For a moment, she stood beside him, gazing out at the same view. You're still here, she said, her voice softer than usual. I thought you would have left by now. Mark turned to her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. I don't know where else I'd go, he replied honestly. This is all I have now. Eleanor didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she looked out at the view, her expression unreadable. Mark had gotten used to the silence between them, but tonight, it felt different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a quiet understanding that neither of them was truly happy with how things were. You don't have to stay, she said finally, breaking the silence. You're free to go whenever you want. The contract is just a contract. There's no obligation. Mark's heart sank. He had expected her to say something like this, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. I didn't sign up for a contract, he said quietly. I signed up for a chance. A chance to build something, to have a future. Her gaze shifted to him, and for the first time, Mark saw something in her eyes that wasn't just business, something raw, something real. And what if that future isn't with me? Eleanor asked softly. Mark took a deep breath, trying to process her words. I don't know, he said honestly. But right now, I don't know if I can walk away. Not from you. Not from this. Eleanor's lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but she closed them again, choosing silence. She stepped away from him, her figure framed against the city lights. Mark watched her, unsure of what to say next. The distance between them felt even more apparent now, like an invisible barrier that neither of them could cross. Eleanor had always kept a part of herself locked away, and he was beginning to understand why. She had built a life around control, around self-preservation. She couldn't afford to let anyone in, not even him. "I can't keep pretending," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not with you." "I thought I could, but I can't." Mark's heart raced. He wasn't sure if she meant what he thought she did, but something in her words made him feel like the walls between them were finally coming down. "You don't have to pretend, Eleanor," he said gently. "I'm not asking for anything more than what we've agreed on. But if you want more, I'm here." She didn't look at him, but Mark could see her shoulders tense slightly. After a long pause, she turned to him, her expression softening. "You don't know what you're asking for," she said quietly. Mark stepped closer to her, reaching out gently, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. "Maybe I don't," he admitted. "But I think I'm starting to understand that it's not about what we signed up for. It's about what we're willing to give." For a moment, Eleanor didn't respond. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was brief, but it was enough. It was the first real connection they'd shared since this whole arrangement began. "You're right," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling just slightly. "Maybe it's not just about the contract. But I need time, Mark. I need to figure out who I am, without all of this." Mark nodded, understanding more than she knew. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Take all the time you need." And for the first time, Eleanor seemed to relax, just a little. Mark didn't know what the future held for them, but in that moment, he felt like they were finally on the same page. The walls between them were coming down, piece by piece, and maybe, just maybe, they could find something real. Weeks passed, and the tension between Mark and Eleanor slowly began to shift. There was an unspoken understanding now between them, a quiet truce. Eleanor had allowed herself a little more vulnerability around Mark, though it was still rare. She still kept her distance, but Mark could tell she was starting to trust him, even if just a little. Their conversations had shifted from strictly business to moments of real connection, small exchanges about their pasts, shared laughs, and even long silences that somehow felt comfortable. Mark was learning more about Eleanor with each passing day, discovering that she wasn't just the cold, calculating businesswoman she had once seemed to be. She had depth, history, and a heart that had been buried beneath years of control and guardedness. One evening, Mark was working late in his office when Eleanor appeared at the door, her silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. Mark looked up, surprised to see her, as it had been a while since they'd had a chance to talk outside of their regular meetings. "Mark," she said softly, stepping into the room. "I need to talk to you." Mark stood up, his heart beating a little faster. "Of course," he replied, setting aside the papers he had been reading. "What's on your mind?" Eleanor paused for a moment, her hands folded in front of her. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "About what you said to me that night on the balcony." Mark's stomach tightened. He remembered that night all too well. He had told her that he wasn't just here for the business deal, that he wanted something more. He had wanted her to know that he wasn't just another person trying to gain from her wealth. He was there because he genuinely cared, something he wasn't sure she fully believed at the time. "I've been thinking about it too," Eleanor continued, her gaze meeting his. "About what I said. About this arrangement, and how it's been affecting me." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze softening. "I've always kept my feelings under control. I never allowed myself to rely on anyone, because I didn't want to be disappointed. But you've made me realize something." Mark stepped closer, his voice gentle. "What's that?" She hesitated for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. "I've realized that maybe I've been too afraid to let someone in. And maybe just maybe it's time I stopped hiding behind my walls. Mark's chest tightened at her words. This was the first time Eleanor had ever let herself show any real emotion, and it took everything in him to remain calm. He could feel the weight of the moment, and he knew that things were starting to change between them. Eleanor, he said softly, taking a step closer to her. You don't have to hide from me. I've always been here, ready to listen. For the first time, Eleanor's gaze softened, and she looked vulnerable in a way Mark had never seen before. I'm scared, Mark, she admitted quietly. I'm scared of what might happen if I let go, if I let myself care. I've built this empire, but I've done it alone. And now, I'm not sure if I can handle sharing it. Sharing my life. Mark reached out, his hand brushing gently against hers. You don't have to do it alone anymore, he said. I'm not asking for anything more than what we've already built together. But if you ever want more, I'm here. Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, she looked as if she might break down. But she quickly composed herself, taking a deep breath. I've never allowed anyone to get close enough to see this side of me, she whispered. But maybe I don't need to be alone anymore. Mark smiled softly, his heart swelling with warmth. You don't have to be, he said, squeezing her hand gently. I'm here. And I'll be here, no matter what. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the words between them settling in. It was as if they had crossed an invisible line, one that neither of them could go back from. They had both been vulnerable with each other, and for the first time, it felt like something real was growing between them, something that wasn't just built on business or obligation, but on trust and connection. The next few days felt different. The distance between them began to fade, and their interactions grew warmer. Eleanor was still cautious, but there was a new openness in her eyes when she looked at Mark. He could see that she was starting to trust him more, and that made him believe, more than ever, that their arrangement could evolve into something beautiful. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Eleanor looked at him and smiled, a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in a long while. Thank you, she said softly. Mark raised an eyebrow. For what? She leaned in, her smile lingering. For not giving up on me. Mark reached for her hand, his heart full. I told you, Eleanor. I'm not going anywhere. The following weeks brought a new sense of ease between Mark and Eleanor. Their conversations became less guarded, and the atmosphere at the mansion felt different, more relaxed. Eleanor was still a woman of few words, but there was an openness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if she had finally allowed herself to step out from behind her walls, just a little. Mark, too, found himself more at ease in her presence, no longer feeling like an outsider in her world. They began to spend more time together outside of business meetings, going for long walks in the garden or having quiet dinners at the kitchen table instead of the grand dining room. There were no more formalities, no more pressure to maintain appearances. It felt, for the first time, like they were just two people getting to know each other, not as a business arrangement, but as something more. But just when things seemed to be heading in a more personal direction, the past crept back into their lives. Mark was sitting in his office one afternoon, going over some documents, when his phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. We need to talk, it read. His heart skipped a beat, and he couldn't help but wonder what was going on. The last few weeks had felt like they were finally moving forward, so why was she asking to talk now? He stood up quickly, his nerves kicking in, and made his way to her study. When he arrived, Eleanor was sitting by the window, her back to him as she looked out at the estate. There was something different in the air today, something more serious. Eleanor? Mark said gently, stepping into the room. What's going on? She turned to him, her expression unreadable. I've been thinking, she began, her voice steady, but there was a tension there that Mark hadn't noticed before. About everything. About us. Mark's heart sank. What do you mean? She took a deep breath, her gaze steady but distant. I think I made a mistake. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. A mistake? Eleanor, what are you talking about? Eleanor stood up slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice breaking just slightly. "I can't keep pretending that things are just fine. I told myself I could keep everything under control, keep my heart out of it. But I was wrong." Mark's mind raced. He took a step forward. "Eleanor, no one is asking you to be perfect. We've both been through too much to expect that." She shook her head, her voice quiet now. "I never wanted to fall for you, Mark. I never planned for any of this to happen. But somewhere along the way, I started to care. And now I'm scared. Scared of losing control. Scared of what this all means." Mark stepped closer, his heart aching for her. "I don't want you to lose control," he said softly. "But you don't have to be afraid. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to face this alone." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But I've always been alone, Mark. I built this life on my own, and now I don't know if I can trust anyone enough to let them in. I don't know if I can trust you. Not the way you want me to." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Eleanor, I'm not asking for anything more than what we already have. I'm here. I'm not going to push you. But I want to be with you. I don't want you to push me away." For a long moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. She just stood there, her hand resting in his, her gaze fixed on their joined hands. Mark could see the internal battle playing out in her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can do this, Mark. I don't know if I'm ready to let you in, to let anyone in." Mark's heart tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand. But I'm here when you're ready. I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. And for the first time, Mark saw a flicker of something of vulnerability, a softness that hadn't been there before. She nodded slowly, her grip tightening around his hand. "I need time," she said softly. "But maybe, just maybe, I can try." Mark smiled gently, relieved that she was opening up to him even just a little. "That's all I'm asking for, Eleanor. Take all the time you need. I'm here for you, no matter what." And with that, for the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor seemed to let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was ready to take a step forward, and so was Mark. Together, they would figure out what came next, one step at a time. Weeks had passed since their conversation in the study, and slowly, Mark and Eleanor began to find their footing. The walls between them had crumbled further, and there was a new sense of understanding between them. Eleanor had stopped hiding behind her usual cold professionalism, allowing herself to be more vulnerable, though she was still cautious. Mark, on the other hand, had learned to respect her pace. He never pushed her, always waiting for her to take the next step on her own terms. But something was different now. They shared moments of quiet companionship, small gestures that spoke volumes, a hand brushing against another, a smile that lingered a little longer than usual. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough for both of them. One evening, as they sat together in the library, the quiet between them was comfortable, not filled with awkwardness or uncertainty. Eleanor, who had been flipping through a book, suddenly set it down and looked over at Mark. Her expression was softer than usual, and there was a hint of something unspoken in her gaze. Mark noticed it immediately, his heart beating a little faster. He set down his own book and turned to face her. "Mark," Eleanor said softly, her voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking." She paused, her fingers tapping nervously on the arm of her chair. Mark could see that she was choosing her words carefully, as if what she was about to say mattered more than anything they had talked about before. "About what?" Mark asked, his voice gentle, his eyes never leaving hers. "About us," Eleanor replied, a hint of hesitation in her tone. "About this arrangement, about what we've been building here." She sighed, looking down for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she looked up again, her gaze was steady, but there was a new vulnerability in her eyes. "Mark, I think I'm ready. Ready to let go of the control, ready to let myself believe in this. She gave a small, unsure smile. I've spent so long keeping everything locked away, but I don't want to keep doing that anymore. Not with you. Her voice wavered slightly, and it was clear to Mark that these were words she had been struggling to say for a long time. Mark's heart raced. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. For all the progress they had made, this moment felt like a breakthrough, a shift from what they had to what they could be. He reached out, his hand gently resting on hers. You don't have to rush, Eleanor, he said softly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You're not alone in this. I've never wanted anything from you except for you to be yourself. I'll be here, whenever you're ready, for whatever you need. He could feel the weight of her words, and he wanted her to know she didn't have to carry that burden alone anymore. Eleanor's eyes glistened, and she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that Mark had rarely seen before. It was the kind of smile that reached her eyes, a smile that spoke of hope and possibility. Thank you, Mark, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Thank you for being patient with me. I didn't know if I could do this, but, now, I think I can. I think I'm ready to give this a real chance. She squeezed his hand, her grip warm and reassuring. Mark leaned in slightly, his voice tender. I'm proud of you, Eleanor, he said. I know it hasn't been easy, but you don't have to do it all on your own. Not anymore. There was no doubt in his mind that this was a turning point for them, a moment that marked the beginning of something deeper. For the first time in a long while, Eleanor allowed herself to fully embrace the feeling of connection. She leaned in just a little closer, the air between them charged with the quiet intimacy that had been building for weeks. She wasn't sure where this journey would take them, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone anymore. And for Mark, that was everything. Together, they would face the challenges that lay ahead, not as two people in an arranged marriage, but as two people who had found something real in each other, something that neither of them had expected but both needed more than they realized. And in that moment, they both knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Months passed, and Mark and Eleanor's relationship continued to evolve. What had started as a business arrangement had transformed into something more meaningful, something neither of them had expected but both of them needed. They no longer lived under the same roof as strangers but as partners. Eleanor, who had once guarded her heart fiercely, now allowed herself to experience the warmth of connection. Mark had proven to be more than just a man of promise. She was someone who stood by her, someone who believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. They were building a life together, one step at a time. The walls Eleanor had built over the years began to crack, and with each passing day, she let a little more of herself show. She laughed more, shared more, and most importantly allowed herself to trust Mark. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of hesitation, moments where the old doubts crept in. But Mark was patient. He didn't push her, didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. He simply held her hand and waited, knowing that, in time, Eleanor would find the courage to take the leap. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Eleanor and Mark sat together in the garden, the air warm and still around them. Eleanor looked at him, her heart full. She had come to realize that this life they had built, this real, honest connection, was more than she had ever dreamed of. Mark had become not just her partner in business but her partner in life. Mark, Eleanor said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I never thought I could trust someone like this. I never thought I could let someone in the way I've let you in. Mark turned to her, his eyes warm and reassuring. You don't have to thank me, Eleanor, he said quietly. I've always known that you had the strength to open up, to trust again. All you needed was someone who would be there, without judgment, without expectations. She smiled softly, reaching for his hand. I don't know what the future holds, Mark, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. Not when I have you by my side. Mark's heart swelled at her words. He had come to realize that, in all the years he had spent struggling, he had never really understood what it meant to be truly happy until now. Eleanor had taught him that happiness wasn't just about success or security, but about finding someone who cared enough to stay, even when things were hard. As they sat there together, the weight of everything they had been through, all the fears and uncertainties seemed to disappear. In that moment, there was nothing but peace between them, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt like she had finally found the one thing she had always wanted: a sense of home. Sometime later, Mark and Eleanor stood in front of a small gathering of friends and family, their hands clasped tightly together. It was a small ceremony, nothing extravagant, but it was perfect. They had come a long way from the cold, calculated arrangement that had started their journey. They had built something real, something built on trust, vulnerability, and love. As they exchanged vows, Eleanor smiled at Mark, her heart full. "I never thought I'd find love this way," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "But I know now that love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be real." Mark smiled back, his voice steady. "You've shown me that, Eleanor. I've learned that love isn't something you find. It's something you build." And as they exchanged their first kiss as husband and wife, surrounded by the people they loved, Eleanor finally understood the truth. Home wasn't just a place or a person, it was a feeling. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she had truly found it.